Hello. Okay, so I'm going to show how I'm testing a service in this application. We look at the controller. This is the events controller in a namespace called Conversations, which is the version 2 of this API. In this controller, we are using a destroy event and a deactivate event, and we're probably not going to have time to look at both, so let's focus on the deactivate. What this does is it deactivates a conversation event. What is that? A conversation event is something that the user can add to their calendar, and it's a series of conversations that they hold, kind of like meetings, in their calendar. So an event can be a member of a series, obviously going every week, every 2 weeks into the future, etc. So we want to deactivate these events if the user chooses to remove them from the calendar, but obviously past events should stay in their calendar. So if we look at the deactivate service, there's already some logic in here and some code, for example, and what we want to do in this scenario is we want to check that the user can only deactivate a series of events if they are recurring, because the other thing they have the ability to do is to create one-off events that only happen one time. So it doesn't make sense to deactivate those, they have to be deleted. So we're going to add the code to do that and the test to do that. So if we go to the deactivate service spec, we can see there's already one. I've actually commented out these tests above just to speed things up, and we have one validation test here which checks that you cannot deactivate events that are in progress or events that are in the past. So we can copy this code because it's fairly similar. Let me just show actually that I've ran the tests, and we can see that the service, the activate service spec, ran that one test and it passes. And here we have the tests for the requests, which is the API, the endpoint, and we see there are 2 tests there which currently pass. So we can copy this scenario because it's very similar. And in this scenario, we want to actually test that the user is trying to deactivate a non-recurring event. So we will need a new context here. We'll create that in a second. And the error message, we've already put this into the translations files, which is conversations event deactivate service cannot deactivate, and this will be the message saying non-recurring events cannot be deactivated, use delete instead. So that's the error message that we expect to get back here. Let's just check that there was a full stop. Right, yes there was, okay. And it should throw a validation exception, and it should get this error message. Obviously if I run that now, that will fail because we don't have that. Well, first of all, we don't have the context, so let's add this shared context in the event helper. And again, we can copy the previous one because it's fairly similar, but we do have to be careful when we copy and paste that we change the things that we need to change. So it's setting up a context to deactivate a non-recurring event. So let's call it a non-recurring event. That's the object we're going to be creating, and in this case is recurring will be false. Now the other thing is that we don't want this event to be in the past, because that would trigger the other validation. So we should actually make this event be in the future rather than now. This one here is an in progress event because the start is at the current time. So this one we want it to be in the future. And we don't want it to be recurring, so it's a non-recurring, i.e. one-time event. And there we can see that that failed because it couldn't find the shared context. So we run it again, it will now find the shared context. And then we can start working on the actual code to make that test pass. But since the same code will also be used by the API endpoint, we can also add a test in here. And this is the one where we currently only have one test. So if we copy this one, because it's again a similar result in that, or slightly similar, we're going to try and deactivate. So let's say when attempting to deactivate a recurring event, and we want the same context to be used for the API test, deactivate a non-recurring event, and that's going to be a non-recurring event because that's what we called the object in the shared context. But in this scenario we don't expect a 200 response, we actually expect an error. I think I already have in the API helper, API client expects errors, so we can use this shared example because we expect a 422 response. Deactivate spec, so this is the response that we expect here. The non-recurring event is the object. Okay, so if we now run the request spec, so we just confirm that the service one has failed. Nothing was raised, so the validation error wasn't raised because the code isn't there yet. And this test should also fail for the API call on that request. It's expecting an error, but obviously the validation isn't being raised, so this will also throw that error. Yeah. So it expected a 422, but it got 200. So if we now go to the actual code, which is the deactivate service, and we can now add a new validation, and we want this to be checking if it's a recurring event. So here, now I'm using something called GitHub Pilot, which might predict the code. Yeah, see, so I'll press tab now. It's going to try and predict the code that I want. It's an AI plugin from GitHub that does code prediction. So this one is cannot deactivate because that's the key that we used in the translation file here, cannot deactivate, to return that message. So we've gone back to the service, save that file. So we'll add this error unless the event is a recurring event. So that should be good to go. So here we can see when attempting to deactivate a non-recurring event, it throws the validation exception. And if we scroll up, when attempting to deactivate, oh, that's interesting. The request, where is the request? That doesn't look quite right to me. I forgot the word none in there. So when attempting to deactivate a non-recurring event, so it was just the name of the context was wrong. Thanks very much.